Once again, Batman GM here, Twilight 2000. As the GM, as the game master that's supposed to be running this thing, we've yet to get it going. We're getting closer. There are a few roadblocks, and I'm also studying up on the base concept and rules. One of the things that GM Bloodworth had touched on in his video yesterday, was how the game handles what's called recovery and post-battle damage. So, like any game, any role-playing game, or the lion's share of them, that involves some level of violence. Our player characters take damage. So do our non-player characters. So people get hurt, get hit, some die. Now, most game systems, especially heavily into the fantasy games, as GM Bloodworth pointed out, and as you well know, are loaded with dodges, cheats, quirks, tricks to extend and repair extensive amounts of damage in a very short period of time. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's not fair. That is part of the game, because that's what we want the players. As the players, we want that ability. I will still remind you, and I know I shouldn't have to, and I probably don't need to, that every one of those game systems also has a mundane way of healing. How much time it takes to heal X amount of hit points or X amount of damage or whatever the token there is that keeps track of the impact of combat on the player character and how long it would take under most conditions. So, if you didn't have access to priests and spells and potions and magic elixirs and special plants and what have you to expedite damage repair, then you're even loss of limb, it's going to take much longer for the game to progress. Especially if you really look at the average encounter, and I don't care what genre you play in, whether it's neo-post-apocalyptic or sci-fi or fantasy or what have you, the real encounter where somebody gets 50% of their hit points taken away, that's a lot of horrific damage to the body. And under a real-world scenario, it would take some time under care of a healer, if possible, to recover from. You just don't turn around sometimes within an hour of the same, in the same day and have yet another bloody encounter. Or if you do, attrition starts to take its toll. There is a terminology in the military parlance, and you'll excuse me if I can't fire off the exact wordage and verbiage for it, but I understand the concept behind it. There's a certain point where you start to take damage, your units take damage, and then it expedites damage. So in additional or further encounters while the unit is diminished or wounded, will speed up how fast that unit is destroyed, or that individual is destroyed. So if you got to keep pushing yourself through one firefight after another or one sword battle after another within very short periods of time, and you don't have a chance to rest and recover or take your wounded and get them medical attention and heal up, then your chances of not surviving the day is increased exponentially. And that's true. That's also one of the reasons in history where you get these horrific victories where the one side won, but at such cost that it would have been better if they hadn't won the battle, if they'd have withdrawn or hadn't fought at all. We won the field, but it had the cost of the army to do it. So if your soldier has to go on and on and on, fight after fight after fight, in a short period of time, you're going to be in trouble. And only magic and spells and wishes can make that go away. Now, there's some science fiction game systems that also have quick fixes. In Star Wars, for example, The magic of the Bacta tank will speed up and expedite healing, but it still takes a little bit of time. And there's medical packs, and then there's that will help keep you alive, and then there's other technology, and of course there's technology to replace things like somebody lopping your limb off. Ask Luke Skywalker about that, and how that works out for you. So the fact is, we've gone out of our way as game creators, as game masters and players, to find ways to bend the rules of attrition and damage to our favor, to make it expedite the ability and, in some sense of the word, justify why our player characters are able to continue without taking weeks or months off, right? So in Twilight 2000, you don't have a lot of that. You're using real world technology circa 1990s 2000 with access to fairly decent medical care. You have a good chance of surviving. Well, when the world takes a big shit and most of your major cities are in shambles and your militaries are on the ropes, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, their abilities to take care of those wounded and to rush those critically wounded to MASH units and stateside or backcountry hospitals is greatly diminished, and in some places non-existent at all. So the truth of the matter is, getting wounded, even minor wounds, will accumulate in this game. And I noticed that, while I had never played it, I have noticed it in my reading, and I've noticed it from listening to a few people who have played it, that this is a critical piece of how this game system plays out. And knowing that, I actively encourage the players that are going to participate in this thing to make a second character, to have a red shirt in the background. Now, we have an advantage because we're using a military concept here. We're using a military unit that's going to go out on more or less as a group and accomplish a couple goals, and then if it survives, we'll move on, and if the players want to continue. They may or may not like my style of running things, and that's the way it'll work. The advantage of this kind of style or game system is that you can have a plethora of player characters. The PCs can come and go. You can have somebody get shot and wounded in the first hour of the first session of the game and replace that character with another body, as long as you're capable of divorcing yourself from the original character. Obviously, we don't have clones to fill in for lost favorites. So the chances of attrition can be fairly high in a game like this, and long-term attrition is just as bad, especially when we have factors for rules for things like disease and illness and infections to expedite that problem. Now, I've had and viewed a number of videos in the past 6 months or so by some very respectable individuals that I highly respect their opinions of. Sadly, don't see much of their opinions being voiced anymore on the video response show channel for some reason, or in any of the channels I follow anyway, post-wise, that we don't want to play blah, blah, blah. We want to play a storyline based, and we want all this mechanics and blah, blah, blah. Okay, but even in a story-based, because that's pretty much what this play-by-post is going to be, is a story-based game system. The players have yet to catch on to that we're not having a tabletop war game here. This is not going to be heavily chipped out. You're not going to see a whole lot of miniatures on maps positioning themselves and running around. There's going to be crude maps, and a lot of it's going to be verbiage. So, and the advantage of play-by-post is that I can take different perspectives and play it simultaneously. So if a couple of these characters and a couple of those characters, PCs, get on opposite sides of a battlefield and are cut off from the other side of the group, they can still function and act without slowing down the play of the other side. And then later, it comes back as a story. So a post-mortem story, if you will. So a running novel. And both sides get to read the adventures of what the others were doing while they were doing what they were doing. So in case of the Ranger Scouts that may occasionally have to make solo forays into the surrounding areas and things like this, we may see what they're doing, but not exactly at the moment they're being done. So it makes it for a different kind of challenge for the player that's playing, because they may not have a full picture of the whole field, which is the true fog of war, if you're familiar with the term. Now, when we're dealing with the damage side of things, it says recovery. A character may recover from one slight hit per body part per day. A character may recover from one serious or critical hit per body per week. All serious and critical hits must be recovered before any slight hits may be recovered. So, if somebody takes a seriously critical hit, it could take months for that player character to be fit enough to be in action again. Then there has to be some hard questions asked and maybe some hard decisions made. Do we slow down the pace of the campaign to carry our heavy wounded along with us? We're not an entire functioning military organization anymore. We don't have access to the option to evac them back to the MASH. We might be able to leave them with some of the locals and hope that the locals don't stab them in the middle of the night or leave them out in the woods for the wolves, because as soon as the group's gone, because they don't have the supplies and means to take care of their own, let alone strangers from a strange land who've been tearing up their neighborhood. For good or bad intentions aside, doesn't matter. Survival's survival, right? Or maybe if they're critically wounded enough, we have to make that harder, even harsher decision to give them an opt-out. Here's your bullet. Or do we do it for them? Is that what they want? And then the player has to, make that decision. Do I continue playing the game? Do I step up as a new character from a different perspective? And am I capable of doing that? Can I divorce myself from all the investment I put into the first character to play a second character? In part, one way of dealing with that in this style of game system with play by post is the ability to run multiple characters without them being hand in hand. So ideally, it's like different characters in a book, where these people are over here doing this and those people are over here doing that, and sometimes their paths rarely meet. And that means the player who's playing both characters doesn't have to have some awkward conversation with himself or herself. That's just my take on that. So, and then we talk about having access to medical care. So, of these 7 would-be players, does anybody have medical skills? Have any of you devoted your time to be the troop's medic? Because you're going to be a very valuable and invaluable individual if you have. And if you haven't, then I have to have an NPC that does that. And it makes that NPC critically valuable. So there's a possible secondary character for somebody if they really want to play that role, because it's a support role. They're going to spend a lot of time, looking after the wounded and not being involved in the firefights, unless there's no other options. Not saying that that's not necessarily going to work that way, because I'm just narrating this thing. I'm going to put the problems out there for the players to solve, and then we'll see how they solve it, correct? And then we go into things like moving wounded. So it says critically wounded character suffers at 1 additional hit point for each period in which he is moved, either by hand or in a vehicle. So bouncing down the road in the middle of the day or the middle of the night is hard on a body, even when you're intact. Well, you're physically in bad shape. You're bleeding out, or your potential for bleeding out. You've had internal damage. And the medic's been able to patch you together as best he or she can, and then we're going to bounce you down a series of roads because we just have to get on to our next objective. So there's a good chance that could kill you, because you're now going to be suffering additional hit points. You're not going to recover as you're burning up those hit points you do recover from the downtime trying to survive. We're back to that, what do we do, right? And in the ideas of the game, I've heard all of it. It's very rare that any of you guys can come up with something that I haven't heard when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I pretty much feel confident that I can say the same about most of you. That there's only a limited round of options when it comes to dealing with wounded characters. So one of the buyouts would be we take a game hiatus, i.e. Magically 3 weeks or 5 weeks or 2 months as we've time traveled into the future by just nodding and a wink and saying so. So now our characters are all recovered, but X amount of time has passed. And that works for certain style of game systems. One that's running against a calendar and a clock, not so much. That's another interesting. No, I'm not saying unique, but an interesting trait of this game system is that you're actually running against a clock, because there's further modules up the road that require timing. So, for example, that critical junction of the going home module, when the U.S. military decides it's had enough in Europe and starts to withdraw and makes that decision to withdraw, it's all or nothing. So at that point, your character group needs to either be able to join the exodus and go home, or at that point decide they're staying in Europe permanently and go forward from that perspective. Or later try to find another alternate route to get home on their own, which the game does allow for a couple venues for that. But the truth is, we still have a clock running. We also have a clock running by time. The Howling Wilderness module source book is quite detailed about what's going to happen between the famine and the weather pattern changes and the strings of social society is unraveling faster and faster. So the odds are your group's going to be coming into a much more unfamiliar territory as the game goes by, but it's based off of time. So if your characters start taking 3 or 4 weeks off at a pop, those time expedites. It's not 3 years before going home, it's months. In theory, it's like 3 or 4 months from the beginning of the game to when going home occurs. So within 4 or 5 months of in-game time, of game world time, the boats are leaving. And if you spent one battle and spent 2 months recovering from that battle so your whole group can continue to function, you've sacrificed a lot of options. You're not going to be able to play certain things. It's just like, in my opinions, there's certain cues in the modules that are time driven. And if you extend past that time, then those are no longer optional options. So that event's taken place was just somebody else that did it or didn't do it. And those NPCs may not be there anymore. Those people who are running things may be dead or moved on, and so on and so forth. And it makes for a challenge for both the players and the GM. So it's one of those things that'll be interesting as this experiment progresses to see how that plays out. If any of you are interested in that or not, I don't care, really. And then, of course, let's talk about infection. Every time a character suffers a hit from melee combat, fire combat, or burn damage, there's a chance of infection. After every firefight or accident, each injured body part has a 20% chance of becoming infected. If a medic treats the wound within 8 hours, the chance of infection is 10%. If a medic treats the wound within 8 hours using antibiotic or of any variety, the chance is of 1%. Pretty good chance if you've got the stuff and the people to survive an infection. But what happens when you don't have the medic? What happens when you don't have the medicine? The limited amount of medicine. The factories aren't churning out antibiotics anymore, and the civilian population, they want to hoard what little supplies they have that they've pilfered or stolen or plundered or purchased or traded for, or they've had in their medical, in their medicine cabinet. They're not going to want to hand that stuff over to you, and your choice for resupply for your command unit's gone down considerably. The military's falling apart. You're cut off from friendly lines. Your only sources are the civilian population and the Warsaw Pact units, and they're not likely to want to give up their medical supplies either because everything's limited. So what happens when something like that occurs and your character gets infected and he can't heal properly, or her foot falls off? What do? How do you proceed? It can be probably as daunting or as harsh as any of the options that can come up in a game like this. And that's, like GM Blufford points out, that makes this game so real world unique or tied in or very interesting, is the dilemmas in the storyline, if you want to call it that, based off of the mechanics of the game system. I don't have to make a bunch of slew of rolls. You took a hit, we toss a die. Do you have a medic? No, the die percentage just went up. Do you have antibiotics? No, your die percentage just went up. Your wound got infected. This is going to expedite you taking damage, not healing damage. You're going to die. Your character's not going to live through this, or if so, it's going to take a long time recovering, and now you are a problem for the rest of the group as a character. As a player, how are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle that?